Thank you for listening to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast extension of the nonprofit that educates and engages individuals on mental health awareness and suicide prevention through pop culture. We're talking Girl Interrupted. Hope you guys enjoy. Well, I'm excited about this episode, and I am joined by the ever lovely Miss Abigail Bardwell. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing so great. Thank you for having me, per usual.
Per usual. You brought a guest with you. This is the first time this has ever happened. Who did you bring?
So it is none other. Oh, it's gonna rhyme. It is none other than my mother. Here we have the great Margie Bardwell.
This is exciting.
Hello.
Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, this is really exciting. Especially following just kind of how Abigail and I had met, and just how much of a formidable just blessing she has been to victims and villains. So it is really awesome to meet the individual that brought her into this world.
Well, thank you. I like Abby too. I think she's very special and a very, very beautiful young woman, inside and out.
Wow. Jeez, guys. Thanks. Jeez.
Well, we are, like I said in the intro, we're talking about Girl Interrupted, the 1999 movie directed by none other than James Marigold and starring Winona-Ryder, and an incredible performance from Angelina-Jolie, among others. This movie made me really miss Brittany Murphy. If I can be completely honest, I really grew up on a lot of her movies, and she was kind of the first like celebrity death that like it's like, oh no, these guys don't live forever.
Yeah, totally. She was amazing in this movie. Everyone was amazing in this movie. I think this was the first movie that I watched that I just really enjoyed every single cast member for what they brought.
Also, I didn't recognize this until I like was doing like research on this, but there's a very young Elizabeth Moss in this. She's unrecognizable as Polly, and when I like was Googling it, I was like, man, Moss is in this? Because she's gone on to become one of my favorite actresses in the last couple of years with her Smell and what I've seen of Handmaid's Tale, and of course last year's Invisible Man, and just also Us. But yeah, she's really good in this movie as well, and they did a great job on her effects. Whoopi Goldberg, also great performance in this as well. It's just, yeah, I totally agree. This movie has terrific performances around the entire cast. There is just not a moment that goes by where you're just not just enthralled by these actors and actresses, and Jeffrey Tambor probably has one of my favorite scenes in this as well, and we'll get into this. But this movie is interesting because this is a movie that I feel like in recent years kind of is gotten lost in the public eye. I just, for whatever reason, it feels like the year 1999 had so many incredible movies come out of it, and this one kind of often gets left out of the conversation because it gets overshadowed by films like Fight Club and The Talented Mr. Ripley, which you can check out our episode on the latter. But this movie, Abigail, what is this movie about?
So basically, this movie is about a young woman. She has a little bit of a mental breakdown. It's in the mid 60s. I'm not sure. I think it's 1966 is when this movie starts. It spans a little more than a year. But the main character, Susanna, played by Winona-Ryder, she admits herself into a psych ward under false pretenses of not really understanding the psych ward and like all that pertains to it. And she gets diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And it's one of the first times that I had ever really heard about borderline personality disorder. And then it echoed into my life as my sister was diagnosed with it. And then myself, it's like I couldn't get enough of it, so it's but it just goes it goes the year that she was in the psych ward as a patient. And it's really fascinating if you compare kind of like the culture back then in terms of mental health as compared to how it is now. I just find it a really fascinating film.
Yeah, it's a really well done character study. I haven't read the book, but going off of your notes, I imagine that you did. But I think this movie takes place towards the latter half of the 60s. Because there is one scene where they actually do talk about the assassination of MLK. Yes. It really kind of places it into perspective. It's really weird, like seeing some of the like the TV shows that they watch in the TV room, because it's very brief. But I'm not terribly old, but I'm like, man, I grew up on this shows. Like TV Land was my jam growing up. For some reason, I was a 60s kid living in a 90s world. I don't know how to explain it. But I grew up on like stuff like I Dream of Jeannie, Bewitched, Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley. Like I just watched all that stuff with my mom, and so I'm done embarrassing myself. But this movie does do a great job, like you said, of really showcasing and kind of introducing audiences to what borderline personality disorder is. But for people maybe that haven't exactly seen the movie or haven't seen it in a while, or didn't really walk away with a clear understanding of what Bpd is, can you kind of give us some background on it?
Yeah, so basically it's a personality disorder, quote unquote, that was first diagnosed in the 30s. There's actually a scene in the movie where Suzanne is like, it's borderline between what and what? Like, what am I on the borderline between? Originally, it was the borderline between neuroses and psychosis. It's interesting now because neuroses, or being neurotic, again, the air quotes, being a neurotic person is no longer diagnosable. So they are planning on changing what is now borderline personality disorder and changing it into being called something like an emotional regulation disorder. There are like really 9 big components to it, kind of having a shifting self-image, chronic feelings of emptiness, having inappropriate bouts of anger, being extremely suicidal, or having self-harm behaviors. The list goes on. But it's something that has kind of gone under the rug in terms of mental health disorders. And my baby doll, Pete Davidson, shout out Pete Davidson, hello, I love you. He's a comedian, but he's kind of like one of the first people who's come out as someone in the spotlight who has a borderline personality disorder. So it's something that has been kind of picking up speed in terms of people kind of understanding it and coming to terms with it. But it's very, very stigmatized. 10%, and studies, 10% of all of those diagnosed with borderline personality will complete suicide. My sister was one of those people. And so for me, I have a very intimate relationship with borderline personality disorder as someone who has it, someone whose sister suffered with it, and someone who works in the mental health field.
Margie, if I can kind of, get a little bit personal with you, like we talked last year with Abigail and kind of the story of what it was like for her to kind of go through and see her sister go through this, but being a mom, like what was that kind of like for you? Because we kind of see how Susanna's mom, and we'll talk about it here in a little bit, deals with it, but what was it like for you to kind of watch someone that you raised go through borderline?
I think it was very, overwhelming, and I was fearful. And I was also put up my guard. I felt defensive because, the parents are often well, I don't think there are anymore, but it's a stigma for the parents, because a lot of the people that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder have suffered emotional or physical or sexual abuse in the home. And so my walls went straight up, honestly, and I kind of went into a freak out mode, and there's a lot of guilt. I'm still dealing with it. I wasn't very educated on the diagnosis. I knew Erin was living away from us. She was going to school in New York. And I knew that she was going to group therapy, and I knew that she was helping herself. And that's what I used to say to her a lot. She was a very intelligent person who was attuned to, her psychological progress, her mental health progress, and she attended group sessions, and I thought she was doing the work. And more than once I would say, well, you know what to do, you've got this, you've got a handle on this. And I think the thing that's really frustrating that I've learned since is that I felt so guilty. I don't think I showed her the love I should have shown her in the way she needed to have it expressed. I still deal with that, but I've come to know that no matter how I had placed that, given it to her in her lap, she just did not feel worthy of the love. So no matter how much I expressed my love and my need for her in my life, she didn't hear it. And so that's, I think, for a parent and also for friends and people in relationship with someone who lives with borderline, I think that it's just very frustrating. And, I honestly had moments of panic. You can't wrap your mind around borderline. You just can't. Or around your borderline child. It just doesn't work in the way that you feel like things should be connecting and fit together. And it's still a mystery to me, honestly.
I think, we're still growing. We're still learning a lot about the brain and kind of how we process things, like Abigail was just talking about, changing what is now considered borderline. In the 60s, where this movie takes place, a large portion of, I think, our psychotic, that's not the right word I want to use, but like a psychologist point of view, or like a scientific understanding of how our brain processes traumatic events, or just a number of things that would cause events that could cause borderline personality, whether that is something that we experience in trauma, mm-hmm. or it's something hereditary.
Yes,
it's still something that we're still learning, to where now we're trying to give it a new name, the emotional dysregulation disorder. I probably mispronounced that, and if I did, super sorry.
You're good.
But we're constantly just updating our practices, and there's so many scientific breakthroughs, and I do imagine that it really was hard for you to process and to deal with this. And
yes,
we even see it.
Erin was a very talented and vibrant human being, and it's there's so many ups and downs with her progress, and I was given the hope. I read up, as soon as it's a lot to take in. Honestly, I had to read up in little portions, the genetic factor, the hereditary factor, which that can be just as concerning to a mom. I mean that depending on how your guilt works, that can be just as bad as if you think you contributed, by abuse or neglect or what. But yes, I am learning more about it, and I think the more I learn about it, the less, the less daunting it becomes. But it was a mystery to me. It really was. I describe myself as being in the throes, just the throes of crisis. And if you don't have a good foundation in your family or in your social group, I mean, it's difficult to even explain. The symptomatology. It's just like it happens at you, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And also the thing about borderline that's interesting is, Josh, you commented whether it be hereditary or not. borderline is one of those really fascinating mental illnesses where, like you could have the hereditary factors and not have it, and you could have the external traumatic factors and not have it. It really is one of the few mental illnesses that you have to have both the hereditary factors and the external trauma factors. It's kind of like, the electricity is running to the light switch, but the light switch isn't on, but you could turn the light switches on, but you don't have the electricity running to it. It takes both of those things to make the light turn on and have someone kind of complete the circuit of having borderline personality disorder.
Interesting. I think we do kind of see that throughout the course. I think this film does a good representation, and also kind of to go back to the parental view of kind of where Susanna's relationship with her family is originally. There's that therapy session scene where they're all having family therapy with Jeffrey Tambor's character, and this is the scene where he delivers the news that he thinks that Susanna is being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and he brings up that she brings up and asks if it is genetic, and the mom asks, mom says, I can't do this, and then we don't ever see the parents again, and then kind of when Susanna is right on the cusp of kind of that year of being being in the institution, she's at the hearing, and she says, my father's got me a part-time gig at a bookshop to where I can make money, and it's still implied that she's going to live at home, but that relationship comes full circle to where they've kind of gone with both of what you guys have spoken about and both experienced, unfortunately, that your every day is a new day. It's a new chance to learn, and it's a new chance to grow.
Well, that scene actually, so I watched this with Brandon, my fiance, and it was kind of one of those movies where it's like I kind of, when you show someone a song and you're just like, just wait, it gets good, just wait. Like that's what I was doing, and he didn't actually like crack a smile until that scene where she's like, is it hereditary? And there's like that pause, and then the mom's like, well, what's the borderline personality disorder business? And he's just like, well, I don't think it's really necessary to discuss that. like that was the first time in the movie that you could really pick up, like, man, this is going to be like, it's not just going to be serious the whole time. And I really appreciated Jeffrey Tambor's character for that.
Me too. And I got a giggle out of that too from my perch as the mom. I wished her character had been a little more fleshed out, because I really think she was truly in the throes of it, and she was just processing it then, and she was worried about what her friends were going to say. Was she to blame? I'm sure she had some thoughts about her husband over there. She just didn't say them yet, and it's just we did see them visit. I think there was a little flash where they visited her on Family Day. I don't think there was conversation. So they were there, kind of on the outside looking in. I could really relate to them. I think that it would be interesting to have seen it from that perspective, but that would have been a different movie. But we just did. The first time I saw that movie, I really kind of raised my eyebrows at that mom. She was kind of she wasn't a character that you wanted really to be friends with. And when I watched it the second time from this perspective, I just felt a lot of empathy for her, even though we never see her in a good place.
Well, what was her line? She said, Winona-Ryder said, that was like, well, see, what we're having here is a Christmas cocktail party crisis. and it's funny because until you've had a mental health Christmas party crisis, you don't understand. They're true. They're a real thing.
And let me just throw in while I'm thinking of that Winona-Ryder, she was just so articulate, her character, and so smart. And that's the thing with Borderline. They are so smart, and they just have the snappy comeback exactly when it needs to be. It's disconcerting as a parent, but you also think to yourself, boy, that was a really smart comeback. My daughter, has got it going. She's smart, even though it was insulting. And that's how I took a lot of Erin's reactions to me. Just in the background, I thought, well, she's a smart girl. Always supporting her, even in the hard parts.
That's funny.
I think to your point, Margie, about the only seeing very little of this this family dynamic that is Susanna is because I think, and I would love to get your guys' insights on this. This movie hits me completely a different way a second time. Abigail and I were texting earlier today, and I was like, I really didn't enjoy this movie the first time I watched it. I just thought that it was bland, and I was like, it's all right, it's got some good performances in it. But now, as a mature cinephile, I being able to revisit this and then also seeing it from the mental health point of view, I think this film also says a lot about how in the 60s and then above, how we just tried every way just to kind of throw away the problem and put like band-aids on mental health practices and never really address a lot of the larger portions of the issues. So I would love to kind of get your guys' opinions on this, but there's a scene where Susanna, basically right before she goes to Claymore, she basically gets tricked into kind of having to go and basically signs away a year of her life. There's that, and then finally once they actually get to Claymore, they're basically, I mean, they're kind of like in prison, but not really. Like, it's hard to describe because they don't, it doesn't really seem like they care about the patients. They're just kind of babysitting them. That's at least the impression that I got. But in that process of babysitting the patients, they're also getting them just doped up. And you kind of really see the full extent of that is later, once Lisa goes missing, Susanna just kind of really becomes numb, and she just doesn't really want to do anything. But we also subsequently have Daisy that also kind of forms an addiction because of the practice of pills instead of the therapy. And I'm not saying that pills are a bad thing, but I think that we've kind of, at least around this time, there was a lot of mental health practices that you would listen to a person once and then just give them drugs and hope for the best.
Yeah, well, I wish I could say that doesn't happen still.
Oh, I know it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the first time I watched this movie, it was actually with my sister. I forgot how old I was, but, I kind of watched it and was like, oh, wow, like fascinating, like mental health, like psych ward, blah, 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 like I didn't really put that much, thought into it because I wasn't very mature yet. But now, now I'm a person who has worked on these same exact wards of, I've worked ENT and secured inpatient. And so I've seen kind of the rainbow of all of this. And I was talking with my mom earlier about kind of the spectrum of people and diagnoses that they have, because a lot of these things, you would never see someone inpatient for anymore. Like, there was one character who basically they insinuated the reason she was there is because she was a lesbian, but the pills, it is still problematic. I can say, to be fully transparent, there was one time that I was not having a great time. I checked myself in for 72 hours and I don't remember any of it because they just loaded me up with Klonopin the entire time. And, it was one of those times where, I wish I could have gotten something out of it, but really the people do still kind of brush the problematic behaviors under the rug now still.
And the institutionalized medication where they stand in line for their little pill cups, it reminds me of institutionalized food service. I mean, they just have to do it that way to keep it organized, to keep everything going, but it's never, what it should be. It's just a little too not personalized. And the other thing I thought of about her admission is, did you do the math about what it would cost to spend? I thought it was 18 months, but even if it's a year in a private mental hospital now, I mean, that's just not even doable. That's a whole other topic, but cha-ching.
Yeah.
I just can't even imagine, if that is that even an option anymore in a private admission. I don't know. I think I think the state hospitals get a lot of the long-term admissions now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, state hospitals definitely see a lot of the more Lisa characters than the Susanna characters.
Yes.
Well, Lisa too is also an interesting character to talk about, and what a introduction Jolie makes when we get to introduce Lisa to the audience, and kind of during a lot of this, like you had said, Margie, this institutionalized medicine organization of just kind of, here's your meds, you take these for this. You kind of don't really get to see it until the third act, when Susanna's starting to finally make breakthrough. She really sees how dangerous of a mental health influence Lisa is on her. And there's even one point that I haven't seen this movie in years, but I honestly had forgotten about the tunnel scene where Lisa's reading the notebook, and I was like, is there going to be a relapse here? Just because Susanna has kind of made such progress, and there's that point where, she obviously still cares, but for the majority of the movie, their relationship, she's really blind to how bad of an influence she is on her and her mental health.
Mm-hmm. And, it's interesting because that is a big side effect or symptom of borderline is, chameleonizing yourself and pandering. And honestly, like the character Susanna, like she most likely, taking a step back and let's hypothetical for a second, would have remained under that spell for the entire time that Lisa had been there. And there was a scene where she's leaving. Can we just take a moment to talk about Jared-Leto for a second? Oh, Jared-Leto.
Oh, you mean how his beard looked fake?
Those eyeballs are too much, though. But go ahead.
Well, she's leaving. She's leaving, that lucky girl. She's leaving with Jared-Leto, and she cuts her hands on the handrail going out, and that kind of marks like her, her entering into that kind of psychosis phase of borderline, because after that, that's when she starts acting out. That's when she starts going against Val, going under Lisa's spell, kind of seeing herself as a crazy person. I forgot what she said specifically, but it was something along the lines of, well, if they're crazy, then so am I. And just chameleonizing yourself to the easiest situation. And that's something that I struggle with. And I know a lot of other people in my life who have borderline struggle with. So that was an interesting thing for them to include.
She did, though, have a spark of insight, because she knew that she shouldn't leave. I mean, she had a chance to escape, and she had a little bit of, a light went on, and she knew she had to stay. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of hopeful in the midst of all of that. But the thing about people that are sociopaths, I mean, that's their whole mission in life, is to attract people to them, and they do. They're often beautiful and flamboyant, and have personalities that attract people. That's how they work. And so it's not surprising that Susanna would be attracted to her, but then the difference is she immediately molded herself to be acceptable to the sociopath, and that's the borderline personality coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let's jump into some of these other characters and kind of diagnose them, or bring to light really the diagnosis that they have. Abigail, what do you got for us?
So going between the book and the movie, some of them did remain the same. Susanna, as we know, was a person diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Lisa, antisocial personality disorder or sociopathy. Georgina was interesting because the first time and if I say interesting one more time, I swear to God, y'all, so when her diagnosis, both in the book and the movie, is, what is it called? It's called pseudologica fantastica. Mm-hmm. I initially thought that was completely made up. It's not. That really is what pathological lying is called. And Polly was a heartbreaking character, like you said earlier, Josh. Elizabeth Moss played her so well, but she suffered from PTSD. And in the movie, you can see her kind of like always coddling her dolls and dressing she kind of infantizes herself. I was reading some sort of like thesis journals on this, and it's speculated that she kind of had age regression from her PTSD.
I mean, sure. That makes really a lot of sense because, like, you know, if you have a traumatic event that takes place, say, you know, when you're a teenager, you're going to regress back to a time where it was simpler, it was easier. You know, I've never been diagnosed with anything, but I know that there are days where, like, if my day is going hard, then I instantly kind of want to regress to something that reminds me of a simpler time. But I did want to come back to Georgina real quick. To what, and I'm curious if you know this, you know, to what degree of pathological lying do you actually have to be classified under this very scientific term that I am not going to try and pronounce because I will absolutely butcher it.
I was curious about that as well, and I looked into it a little bit. Pathological lying is something that I'm really not that familiar with. It probably, you know, has something to do with like X amount of lies that you tell that kind of disrupts your everyday life. I know with borderline, there's it kind of like X amount of unstable relationships until it like disrupts your everyday life. I don't really think there's a number limit on it per se, but I think it really just depends on, because, you know, everyone lies. Like let's be real. Everyone lies, but it's until it gets to the point of that it just completely disrupts, you know, your reality and your life. I think that's kind of the limit until you become a person with pathological lying tendencies.
I did wonder, though, what the criteria, I mean, what did she do to be admitted as an inpatient into a psychiatric facility being a pathological liar? I mean, it just seems like you would have to, you know, have your hands in a lot of trouble to actually be admitted for that. I actually tried to think of a scenario and couldn't.
I don't think it's something that really is admittable anymore. I think it's more of just like a side effect, like a symptomology. In the book, she was a person with depression. I think they just kind of spiced it up a little bit for the movie.
According to Medical News Today, quote, pathological lying is not recognized as a condition. There are no formidable treatments for it. If a doctor suspects that there is an underlying condition is causing the lying, they may suggest treatment for that condition. And this is as of August 7th, 2019. And I think that kind of just goes along back to the idea of this being the 60s and kind of being very naive in a lot of the practices or the knowledge of mental health. Like, we hadn't come as far as we have now. I think that and this is one of the things that we don't recognize.
That was my dog playing banjo, everyone.
Nice. That we really don't recognize this as a disorder anymore.
That makes sense. Yeah, like I'm trying to like rack my brain, and I don't think I've really experienced anyone who's been like, yeah, I'm admitted with pathological lying, because then it kind of gets to the point. It's like, are you diagnosed with pathological lying?
Well, that's what was so funny with that scene, because she gave this whole traumatic story, and then she said at the end that she's a pathological liar, and Winona-Ryder's face, or what's her character's name, Susanna, was hilarious. Yeah, she's just the realization, did that even really happen, and should I believe her? I think that pathological lying is part of a symptom set, because I think like a sociopath could also be a pathological liar.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what Josh was saying, where it's more of like a symptomology rather than a diagnosis.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
A character that I also really loved in this, let's go back to Daisy, because Daisy and her chickens was a very fascinating character.
Also, one of the most heartbreaking characters in the entire film. I think her scenes the most were some of the hardest to kind of see, especially the final confrontation between Lisa and Daisy, because you it's kind of like hinted at right around probably like the end of the first act. We see a man come visit her in Claymore, and then we don't see him the rest of the movie, and it's inferred that it's her father. But just the kind of like very brief cameo you have, like you obviously can feel that there's probably some pedophilia going on here. And Lisa,
sorry about my dog.
It's all good. I'm gonna edit that out, so I'm gonna come in. Lisa really confronts her and basically like puts it all out on the table. Like she's like, hey, like the reason that you are going through self-harm and the reason why you have this relationship with chickens that you do is because you are basically you've normalized what your father is doing to you. You've just kind of accepted it, and it's never like something that's like outright spoken, but it's implied so heavily. And then her suicide really kind of confirms all the suspicions.
Yeah, I was talking with my mom about this earlier as well. I personally am unsure of the relationship she had with her father. You kind of see it through the eyes of both Susanna and Lisa, who have, pretty unstable ideas of relationships, of, how her father is interacting with her. And, as my mom can tell you, like you don't really know how to interact with a child with a mental illness. And in my perspective, I think he was just kind of doing his best. And I think Lisa, in that moment where she confronts her in her apartment with all of her wicker furniture, I think she's just kind of, like exactly like she said, or like Susanna said she was doing, pushing those buttons.
And, I think that the thing that sent her over, you could just see it in her eyes, is when Lisa said, "And you liked it." You could just see her the light shut out in her. That's the part. That's when she walked away and said goodnight and please leave in the morning. I really think that's the thing that triggered her, but that's just, I'm presuming. But that was such a cruel thing to say and such a presumptuous thing to say. And boy, she found that button and pushed it.
Yeah.
That was really a shocking part of the movie, I thought.
Absolutely, and Abigail, to your point, I think you are right. I think as a film goer, there's always that instant. Horror movies have trained my brain that your mind always goes and gravitates to the worst possible scenario, and so having not been a parent, having not hardly interacted with kids, especially children that do have mental illnesses, I can't speak for a father. I can't speak for a mother, and what you have to kind of the hoops you have to go through in order to make that child feel as normal as possible and to accommodate them. So I want to retract my previous statements and let it be on the record as well, that I do agree with you. I think that you do bring up a valid point that I hadn't considered.
Well, I mean, Brandon was in the same boat. He looked at me and he was like, "Well, do you think that's actually what's going on?" I think that's kind of the magnificence of this movie is a lot of it is just kind of as you see it, like, is Susanna crazy? Is this person crazy? Is that person crazy? And do you believe the crazy, quote unquote, and I say the term crazy as it is presented in this movie,
yes.
As you see it, because immediately, like my mom was saying, you have that scene where it's like, no, this is what that person's suffering from, but I'm a pathological liar. So really, what can you trust?
And kind of before we move on past these characters, so the next morning, this scene follows right afterwards. It wakes up. Susanna goes out for a walk, and she comes back into Daisy's apartment, and she's like, "Oh, hey, has she come down yet?" And it's no. Like Lisa's like, no, she's just been playing this, this really annoying music. And so Susanna goes up to investigate and actually finds her that she's hung herself in the bathroom. And the scene that is a couple scenes later is just such a somber scene. It's a sequence where it's just Jeffrey Tambor's Dr. Melvin character and Susanna just in a car, and there's just like you can just feel the weight of I could have done more, like what could I have said? And this podcast in particular is really an interesting one because I've done over 300 of these shows, and it's the first time that I've outside of the one we did on your sister's Erin's story, where you understand, you connect to those characters and say, I get that feeling. They're not saying anything, but I get it, because when I lost a friend to suicide, like, it was like, man, like, what could I have said? Like, how could, my interactions have been differently? Should I have like gotten more involved? And you just kind of like really just start replaying every interaction you had with that person and try to figure out some way to find hope afterwards. And I love Susanna's response and monologue that she has following Daisy's death. She says, I don't know, that I was sorry, that I never know what it was like to be her, but I know what it's like to want to die. How it hurts to smile. How you try to fit in, but you can't. You hurt yourself on the outside and try to kill the thing on the inside. I felt that every day for just months, and I think that all of us on this call can really relate to that scene.
Well, she also in that paragraph when she's opening up to Val, she's really, ironically, describing all of her borderline personality disorder symptoms in that one paragraph. And then she goes on to say, what is borderline? I don't even know where it is. But really, she described it in that paragraph. That she, why she cuts herself and why she doesn't feel like she's a part of things. It's very heartbreaking, but it's pretty enlightening, too.
Yeah, I've seen this movie quite a few times. But this is the first time that I've seen it, both since, I lost my sister, and both since that, I have struggled with my own mental health and my own borderline diagnosis. And that was really those two scenes, the one where she's driving away after discovering Daisy's body, and the scene where she's talking with Val. Those both were gut-wrenching for me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
it really is interesting. If I swear to God, it. But just looking into movies like these, where they really can age with you. Like you were saying, Josh, the first time you watched this, you didn't really have a connection with it, and now you do. And the characterizations that they have with all these people in the film. It's funny how you can relate to people differently depending on the different part of your life that you're in.
Agreed.
Yeah, movies hit so much differently as you age. We joke around sometimes there are movies that you really love as kids, and then you see them as adults, and you're just like, why was I such a loser growing up? And then you get into movies like this that really enrich you, and they almost validate experiences that you've had, because you're like, man, like, I don't feel alone at all. Like, Abigail, me and you were talking yesterday or Friday about like suicide in particular, about how it's kind of this thing that people know exists, but they don't know the degree to how many families it affects every day, and how many people are hurt by it, both by successful suicides and those attempted. It's really heavy, and I think that a movie like this really helps you to see and understand that you're not alone. Not even really knowing or understanding that experience, like the fallout of what Daisy's father must have felt like getting that call. I can't even imagine the heaviness, and just the sheer, just imagining like a man like picking up the phone and then just collapsing, just because he can't believe it, especially when you're diagnosed as healthy, and then a couple months later you end up committing suicide. Like, what happened? Like, what changed between healthy to now?
Yeah, I think the thing with mental health and mental illness that I always try to tell everyone and kind of normalize with people is there really is no one or the other. Like, it isn't a pragmatic thing of, oh, you're normal and you're not, because really, what is normal? And I know this is in your notes for the film, Josh, but Susanna at the very end, she has this monologue that is talking about what is crazy, and she says, crazy isn't being broken; it's who we are amplified.
Yes.
And when I first started dating my fiance Brandon, like, I kind of joked with him that he's like, the most neurotypical person I'd ever dated, that he kind of grew up in a cul-de-sac and, like played street hockey. And, I was like in my room reading about, like, we don't want to go into that anyway. But it turns out that he can't, eat sandwiches and put them down just because he's neurotic about getting things on his fingers. Everyone has a thing, and everyone has a something, and it changes. And, the heartbreaking thing that you were mentioning, Josh, is that, she did go home and was diagnosed normal. And then what happened? And it's like, really, what is normal? Especially for someone who has gone through those, traumas.
And speaking from the parents' point of view, and assuming that the father didn't abuse her in the way that he was accused of by Lisa, he had a lot of hope. He got her an apartment. She got a cat. It was all set up. She had her kitchen set up. He was expecting her to be well, and she was expecting to be well. And so that's very, very sad, because there was a lot to me, that apartment symbolized hope.
Yeah.
I think one of the main problems as a society that we have is is, again, like normalizing that idea of healthy and not, like if I went into a doctor's office today and they said, oh, you're healthy, I would never expect to be healthy for my entire life. Like I would never, never expect to not be able to come home and have something happen and need to go to the doctor again. And I think that's kind of what happens with mental health is, we're so obsessed with this idea of being normal and being healthy that we could never be not healthy. And, mental health and mental upkeep should be that. It should be preventative. It shouldn't be something that we use as a treatment.
Also, one of the things that I really love, and I am so ashamed of myself as like a cinephile right now bringing this up, but there's a line in Suicide Squad. Never thought we don't talk about that movie. You guys can go check out our
Jared-leto.
our episode on Suicide Squad and but anyways, there's a Harley Quinn says that normal is just a setting on a washer, like, or a washing machine. I can't remember which one she says, but there's even a line in here when there's a taxi driver first taking her to Claymore, and he looks in the rearview mirror at Susanna and says, "You look normal," and it struck me as what. We have this cinematic or like a Hollywood stereotype of what a crazy person should be. And like you said, Abigail, to your point about, Brandon and sandwiches, we all have our thing. We all have that one thing that we don't like. I'm the guy at work that in my day job, I clean. And I'm the only guy in our entire franchise that wears gloves when they clean, and I do this because I just don't want to. I paint my nails, and I just don't want to like have my nails chipped. Like it's a really weird and a really like little thing, but it's just like I just don't want that. And it kind of begged that question to me: is like, does crazy or does a mentally ill person have to have a certain look or a certain appearance, when the answer is no, because mental illness and family of mental illness that's hereditary comes in all different shapes and sizes, races, genders. Like, it doesn't matter. Mental illness doesn't discriminate, neither does mental health.
Absolutely. I remember I actually worked at, I talked earlier about checking myself in for 3 days. I actually ended up working on that same floor that I was a patient on as a peer counselor. And I would, tell some of our clients that, kind of as a message of like, life moves on. It's funny because I was here and I was there and, here I am, like, you can be a client in the later, but a lot of them would kind of look at me with this look of befuddlement and just be like, well, you don't look crazy. Like, you don't look like you were someone who needs to be here. And I would just kind of be taken aback because, yeah, you're right. We really do have this like Hollywood view on what crazy looks like. And it is harmful on the other way too, because if you're someone who may look quote unquote normal and you have a mental health challenge, you might be pushed to make yourself even quote unquote crazier, because like it really does suck to be stuck in the middle of, someone who looks so together and so put together and normal, but then have all of these thoughts and challenges. And it really, you can't push yourself to be healthier without help, but you can push yourself to be sicker. And I think that is a problem that a lot of people face.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression, and you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
In the not-too-distant future, following the rapid succession of World Wars III and IV, plus the hidden horrors of secret World War II, there's not much left. All that remains is a place where folks get together to read and discuss comic books. Sometimes they laugh, sometimes they argue, but they always record and upload their transmissions. You have found one of those transmissions today. Welcome to the last comic shop. Rate, review, and subscribe to our weekly comic book reviews on all the major podcasting platforms at www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com.
Look at Princess Diana. I mean, she was well put together. And then, her story that she told herself. She had an eating disorder, and some people have supposed that she might have borderline. A lot of people have, actually. And, I can't think of a more put together person than she was. Oh, and also in the movies, the first thing they do to make you look crazy is they just mess up your hair. They just make you look disheveled. That's how you know who the crazy one is. In my experience.
It's so funny because I was literally just in my head when I was mentally picturing what an unwell person. I just picture myself just completely disheveled. And you're right, they with Angelina Jolie. I was talking with my mom the other day, and she said our first Facebook interaction that we ever had was over Girl Interrupted. This makes us sound sickly obsessed, but one of the things with Angelina Jolie, it's her chapped lips, man. I just want to go up to her and just slather her down with some Vaseline. But that's, with her stringy hair and what have you, and that's just kind of the hallmark presentation of someone who's unwell. It's they can't take care of themselves.
Yeah. It's kind of sad. And to here, there's in our notes, we all had a beautiful Google Doc that we all shared. Margie, you had put here that this film also handles the repression of female sexuality. We see this several times throughout the film, where there's even a time where Susanna kissed a warden or one of the workers, and he got transferred. John, it says here, John was moved to the men's ward, and Lisa never came back from Dr. Wick's office. And I think this film really, for as female centric as it is, as much as I love James Marigold, you can still tell that this is written from and directed from the point of view of a man.
Well, there was a really good point that Susanna brought up, that, the first time she sat in the psychologist's office was, who determines what promiscuity is? Assuming that promiscuity, at that time was a symptom of borderline, and I'm pretty sure it was, because borderline was mostly necessarily a female's quote-unquote disease. Promiscuity was a big part of it, and she says, how many men does a woman have to sleep with to be considered promiscuous? 1, 4, 5. How many women does a man have to sleep with to be considered promiscuous? 10, 20, 100, and it's true. This film definitely does kind of look into the suppression and oppression of female sexuality. Even just looking at Cynthia, her character being impatient strictly due to being a lesbian. And it's something that you would like to say, oh, it was the 60s. Like, that's not really something that we consider anymore, but it absolutely is.
Yeah, no, you're good. Like, I'm watching this from, like, and again, like, this is the, you know, me from watching it as a man. You know, there are certain things that, you know, I don't pick up, and that's the reason I love having conversations with people, whether it's in this format of podcasting or it's just, you know, just friends talking about movies, is because we all kind of look at something from a different perspective, and I value the different perspectives that you can have on, you know, from cultures and from, you know, races and sex, on how something is interpreted. And again, the repression of female sexuality in throughout the course of this movie, also to your point about Cynthia's, you know, insinuated lesbian tendencies, and you know, just a lot of the, even when Toby comes to break Susanna out so that they can go to Canada, like, there's so much about mental illness and, you know, sexuality and just things that I think back in the 60s we just didn't understand. And you see how far women and LGBT as a community in particular how far they've come, but yet how far that they still have to come to be fully accepted. Because I feel like, and this is just me from a cisgender male, looking into the glass, not being actually on the other side of it, you know, there are still people that I know just don't accept the LGBT community because, you know, they just don't agree with that lifestyle for whatever reason. And then, you know, to some degree, we're still celebrating when, you know, women are making contributions to the world of science and literature and film and just art and so many other different mediums, because, you know, it still, those things are still predominantly male driven.
Yeah, no, as you know, as my mom knows as well, I used to cook. I used to be a chef, and I hope you know that, Mom.
No,
but,
I've heard.
Because then we would have to back it up. No, but I worked at this organization called Fair Start, and you know, I was the youngest and the only female chef instructor at the time, and you know, we had obviously I went through hoops to get that job, and you know, we all had to like be able to do this and lift this certain amount of weight and whatever. Like, I met the same qualifications as any male who would have that job, and every time, I swear to you, every time like I would pick up a bag of onions, like just the looks, like you would think that I was like James Cameron, like taking the Titanic out from under the water. Like, everyone just looked at me just like, oh my God, I can't believe she's picking up onions. And it's like, well, yeah, that like was one of the qualifications for me to be in this kitchen. And it's so frustrating, you know, being someone who's a female in a predominantly male field, which, you know, is most of them, because, you know, I would come home and I would tell Brandon about it, and I'd be like, yeah, you know, it's so frustrating because every time I go to like lift something, there's 18 men like seagulls at a French fry, you know, trying to come help me. And, you know, the way he saw it was, well, they're just being chivalrous and nice. And it's like, well, no, it's condescending, and it makes me feel bad about myself because, you know, basically what they're saying is, oh my God, look, she can lift an onion. Like, well, yeah.
It's funny to me because I was a child during the set of the era of this movie, but I just know from things I've heard from my older siblings and you know, people and Mad Men that women were having sex all over the place. It was cultural. It was you have to keep it veiled, you have to keep it hidden, and the whole promiscuity thing, I think, just has to do with, you know, how well you were able to keep your sexuality or your what am I trying to say? Your desire to have sex and be unmarried hidden. They were having sex all over the place. The ones that got caught, or the lesbians, they're the ones that that went to be admitted. But it was it was happening then. And I think that men are just really confused about gender roles. I can look back. I can totally envision what you were describing, Abigail. But they're just so confused. They don't know what to do. Do we open the door? Do we, they're just confused. And I can understand that. But, times change, and just pay attention and do the best choice, the best thing you can do as far as, respecting a woman. And that doesn't mean picking up the onions, in my opinion. You have to respect her role, respect her strength. But that's all. I'll step down now. I'm getting
No, I think you bring a couple crucial details into perspective too, that this movie takes place right outside of the sexual revolution that was taking place in the late 60s, early 70s, and the free love movement, because I think you were starting to see a lot of that oppression starting to boil up. And also too, the being married, I've been married now for 7 years, and my wife comes from a line of just fiercely independent women. And at first, I had so much of those societal rules in the first couple years of our marriage. And then I remember just sitting back and reading at a Thanksgiving celebration at my mother-in-law's house, and just kind of watching all of the women in the kitchen, and just kind of how they conducted themselves around the home, and just kind of really preparing everything for that day, and just being yeah, my wife's not going to change. I should probably be the one to change it. And so now, kind of ever since that moment, my wife, I let my wife kind of carry the load, so to say, because I want to respect her independence and and who she is as a person, not necessarily rely on societal roles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
Well,
go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, Elizabeth Moth, going back to Mad Men, and her character as Peggy, it's kind of interesting because, I swear to God, guys,
when you said Peggy, my heart pounded. I love Peggy so much. I'm glad you worked that in.
Yeah. I was sitting here nervous, just at the edge of my seat, my mom will kill me if I don't mention it.
Oh my gosh.
Peggy and Polly, both played by Elizabeth Moss.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. So you're welcome. Well, now here's your chance. Say something about Peggy before it goes away.
She was neat.
I don't know if you're a Mad Men fan, Josh.
I am not.
She was super cool. The women in Mad Men, and there was the transition in Mad Men from the 50s to the 60s in the sexual revolution. But even in the 50s, when they wore the wide skirts, like the Lucille Ball dresses, they were still having sex. It just was, wink, wink, nod, nod. It wasn't mentioned in polite society, but it was going on all over the place. And those women did not have to go to the mental hospital. So strange.
I honestly feel like we could probably talk another hour about the history of sex in society, because there's so many, when you look back at kind of the oppression of something that is a legitimate, it's a celebration of love, or the end of a drunken stupor, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
It's many things to many different people. But I kind of want to come back to the cast of characters here, and we've talked about every one so far, with the exception of Janet. And Janet is kind of a interesting character to talk about, because she's the one that deals with anorexia in this movie, and anorexia is an issue that I've wanted to do more coverage of in the future with victims for quite some time. And I think I remember back like in like the mid 2000s, like it was kind of like socially acceptable if you were emo to be anorexia, or at least it wasn't in my circles. I don't know about your circles, Abigail, but to me, like now it's kind of like gone back to this like thing where it's like if you do it, you don't talk about it anymore. It's kind of gone back into that stigma phase.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's really cute that you think I was in a circle. That would involve more than one person.
You're in a circle now.
But no, eating disorders is also something. They're also something that I'm quite familiar with as someone who struggles with them myself. I was a very, very bad bulimic for quite some time, and I still struggle from the effects of that. I had a heart condition from it, and it was really bad. Again, my mom's here; she could tell you all about it. But no, you're right. Definitely in the 90s, when kind of like the heroin chic, quote unquote, was coming in. I think it's something that people kind of strive for and encourage. I remember I did know some people, some of my fellow emos. They had MySpaces, throwback, with we called them Thinspirations, where we would kind of share images back and forth of like the hip bones and the clavicles, and it did go away for a while, but you're right, it is kind of coming back, and it is highly stigmatized. Anorexia not as much, but the different forms of eating disorders like bulimia, very much still stigmatized. They're kind of seen as like gross to people.
I think it's shocking is how I find it. A friend of my, when I was in 7th grade, someone I knew, his sister died from anorexia, and it's the first time I had ever heard. I mean, I went straight to the encyclopedias. I'd never heard of it, and there was a stigma, there was the pain. No one ever talked about it, except how in the world can you starve yourself to death? What's that all about? And then I guess the curiosity went away, and the next time I ever heard of it was Karen Carpenter. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I became more and more familiar with it as it affected our family. But it's befuddling, and there are a lot of there's a lot of aspects to it. It's control, and it's body image, and it could be two different things. You might just want to control, or you might have a body image situation. There's just a lot of things that can happen in anorexia nervosa. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's a very unhealthy condition, and a lot of people die from it. It can be as deadly as some cancers.
Yeah, and anorexia nervosa is the top deadliest diagnosis to have, next to borderline personality disorder in terms of mental health. And you're right, I don't think a lot of people really consider. I definitely didn't consider, because in my head it was like, oh, I'm going to die from being too thin. What? That's ridiculous. But no, then my heart gave out, and I was like, just kidding, psych. But then I dealt with it, and it's something that I think a lot of people do struggle with, whether it be controlling eating or overeating, binge eating, personal starvation, but binging and purging. And I think most people are affected by something similar to it at some point in their lives. But like Josh was saying, there's really not a lot of communication happening around it.
And we, just our obsession with strict diets. We're brought up with that in our culture, how to stay thin and attractive.
Yeah, well, just the yo-yo dieting of keto and controlling carbs.
Yes.
It's like I'm just looking back as a person recovering from my eating disorder, so you're basically telling me that I'm supposed to just eat potatoes. Yeah. Like nothing. That is so unhealthy. Like all of it is so unhealthy, and I wish people just normalized, portion control and eating, but healthfully and treating your body. And I'm saying this as someone who definitely does not treat my body like I love it, but try to do as I say, not as I do. But treating you only have one body, and treating it with kindness and respect. Whatever size or shape you may end up being.
I'm almost curious too if that kind of goes back to the idea of, you know, what we were just talking about with men and how we look at women in the workplace or just in life general, how much of those like societal or even the media really plays a part in that. Do you find that you struggled with the eating disorders because of, you know, the time that, you know, you would spend with people on you know, MySpace talking about how thin someone is, looking at, you know, clavicles and hip bones?
Honestly, I've always been a very naturally thin person, so it really wasn't something on my mind. I, if anything, wanted to be curvier and have more of an ass and have, you know, like boobs. And, you know, I didn't have any of that. I had the clavicle and I had the hip bones sticking out, and that was just my body naturally. My weight and how I appeared in the world wasn't something that I really considered until I was sexually assaulted, and then I really considered how I looked to people, you know. And my eating disorder started as not wanting to be attractive and not feeling like I deserved to have nutrition, and as someone who deserved to. In my head, like when I was at the sickest, I considered feeding myself taking food away from someone who deserved it more. And that, you know, that as I tell people more about, you know, my eating disorder, and I'm going to always be someone who's affected by it. You know, it's kind of like alcoholism. Like once your brain goes there, it never really goes back. And it's always going to be something I struggle with. But I would tell people about my eating disorder, and the lowest I got, I think I was like 76 pounds. Like it was ridiculously unhealthy. I'm surprised I didn't die. And the response I usually get is, "Oh, but you've always been so skinny." And I think, you know, it like my mom was saying, you know, like eating disorders happen for so many reasons other than, you know, perception and how you look to people and how you want to look to people. A majority of the people I know, it has been about control, whether that be from a trauma response or whether that just be, you know, like you wanting to feel proud about doing something for yourself.
And also the factor, you know, you were talking about your assault and everything, literally wanting to disappear. I'm sure that played a part in it, just wanting to disappear yourself and be invisible.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. You almost did. That's a very low weight. I mean, honestly, that's just very scary to think about now.
Yeah,
all the times we could have lost you.
I remember I was in the hospital, and there was like my parents came and they visited me, and I remember my mom being like, "You realize you have an eating disorder, right?" Like I was so deep in like the psychopathy of my eating disorder and controlling it that I wasn't really even thinking about it as an eating disorder, as, you know, crazy as that sounds. But, you know, her looking at me and just being like, "You realize that this is an issue, right?" And like, I could not fathom how I couldn't just leave on my own. Like the nurses and doctors wouldn't let me leave until I hit, drum roll, 84 pounds. And in my head, I was like, this is abuse, you know, like, how dare you want me to be 84 pounds? And I basically like was force-fed muscle milk. But that's how deep in the psychopathy of my mental illness that I was. It's like, I thought that someone forcing me to be 84 pounds was like the end of the world.
And the denial factor is impossible. I mean, until you admit it. I mean, we're looking at you, the doctor's saying, you know, you have issues internally, and you're just in denial. I mean, what do you do with that? It's so frustrating. I'm very happy that you found your way and that you take care of yourself as best as you can now. But it is, you know, you talk about control issues. When that happens and your daughter's an adult, there is no control. There's no control. You just have to hope that her smarts will kick in. Both of our daughters were very smart, and just, you know, figure it out and do the right thing to make yourself well.
There's a scene in the movie where it's Janet, going back to Janet, and they're doing their like rhythmic, you know, dance thing that they're doing, and it's right when Brittany Murphy's character Daisy gets out, and Janet kind of has this breakdown, and I forgot the exact weight that she said, but she was like, "Well, this weight is the perfect weight," and she just like flops on the floor. and just has a breakdown. And, you know, like really that scene, I remember like the first time I ever saw this movie, that scene, it seemed so asinine to me. It's like, well, how, that's a ridiculously low number. How could you think that's the perfect weight? But really, like, it's true. And going all the way back to what you were saying, Josh, is going back to, you know, like really starting to understand, you know, the human psyche and like how we develop. And, you know, the more we know, the less we know, you know, like I wish that eating disorders were something that people were more educated on, because they really are so dangerous, and they do affect how our brains develop. You know, like imagine someone's brain developing with 200 calories a day. Like it doesn't, and it stunts us, you know, and then we react like we flop on the floor, and people look at us like, well, why are you acting like a child? Well, it's because I've eaten 4 carrots in the past 3 days. Like, what do you expect from me?
Brain broke.
Yeah, exactly.
Brain is broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to address?
Oh, I was like, we lost him.
No, you guys are good.
I want to talk about Ruby the cat. Because I thought I remembered it correctly, and I did when I watched the movie again. I am so happy they showed her, the cat, in the first scene, or one of the first scenes, because it starts in the present and then it goes back to the past. Because if I hadn't known that Ruby was okay when she was in the presence of Lisa and she hissed at the cat, I would have been very concerned for the cat's health, because that's another trope, is mentally ill people, you know, are dangerous to animals. I'm glad they presented the cat at the end as a comfort animal, and everyone loved the cat, and the cat was taking care of the people, and it was just kind of a good wraparound and put a bow on the story of the cat.
God, sometimes I'm just like, this is, you're my mother.
I know. I'm sorry. But we like cats.
Literally, my last viewing, I looked over and I was like, oh, woo, there's the cat.
Yeah.
Whoa.
I'm sorry.
No,
it's
you're
the same brain sometimes, I think.
you're good. I think it also leans into you know, one of the things that obviously Susanna, for her, that the way that she finds kind of breakthrough in her recovery process is by journaling. There's a point where she describes, like, it's just like breakthrough. Like I just sat down and it's like a waterfall that just never came. I just talked to the therapist about literally everything that just came to my mind. And also on the flip side of that, you also have animals that are such a great source of kind of therapy. You know, we've done podcasts in the past where we talked about the benefits of using animals like, you know, pets like birds or dogs or cats as, you know, just a form of healing and breakthrough. Like, I know that there are days where I come home and it's just rough, and having a cat greet you can just make all of the difference in the world. And I'm so glad that you kind of brought up Ruby the cat, because it's such a minor detail, but it really does bring emphasis on a completely legitimate side of you know, healing and therapy for people.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Yes, Mom.
I was just going to say, and that is before it was a common thing. So they just kind of introduced that into the story, and it was kind of surprising that they even let the cat stay there. I just thought that was a good little bonus. It was just kind of a feel-good thing on top of a movie that wasn't necessarily made to be a feel-good movie. But, you know, the cat knew. The cat hissed at Angelina's character, at Lisa. The cat knew, and Lisa hissed back. Do you remember that scene? It's just the cat knew that this was trouble.
I've been trying not to laugh this entire time, because Josh, when you listed off animals, for some reason you started with birds.
Look, I have like one of my closest friends, like growing up, he had a bird. Every time we would talk on the phone, and that bird drove me crazy. So it is always instilled into me that people go, it's like, okay, I can only have cats or dogs. And there are people out there that have birds. I have a neighbor that has birds. He's got like an entire flock of birds. I don't know why. Birds aren't my cup of tea, but hey, if you like birds and they get you through the day, as long as you're living until tomorrow.
Whatever gets you through.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all right. I think that is going to do it for us on this episode of Victims and Villains. But where can people find you guys online?
Oh, God. Well, I mean, my handle on Instagram is JangoT, but speaking of cats and dogs, it's literally just pictures of my cat and my dog. But if that makes you feel good, my handle is @JangoT. My dog's name is Travis Barker, and my cat's name is Danzig Coleslaw.
That's great.
And I'm on social network vacay. You can't find me anywhere, and that's good.
Sometimes people need breaks for their own mental health.
On a break.
It's whatever helps your mental health.
Yes.
All right. Well, you guys can find me on Letterboxd @Captain Nostalgia and follow my film journey. But you guys can find us everywhere at Victims and Villains. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and wherever you guys get your podcast from. And most importantly, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net, where you guys can find more episodes like the one you are currently listening to, episodes of our spin-off podcast of That's High Praise, a Nicolas Cage podcast. You guys can also find movie reviews, upcoming events, and most importantly, our mental health resource library. So until next time, stay interrupted.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.